Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome, I'm Rabbi Daniel Katzenberg here of Beth Synagogue. It's really a delight to be with you today to welcome Charlie Duff from Jubilee Baltimore and Gabriel Croix, who I'll introduce in just a moment, for this third installment of our Beth centennial celebration of this historic Joseph Evans Sperry building. Of course, you know that the building is 100 years old. Beth is about 48 years old. We're coming up on our 50th anniversary in just a couple of years. And today is really a chance to talk about the architectural history of this space. You know that the building was renovated just a few years ago, just in time for COVID. We did a multi-million-dollar renovation of this space. I see David Rothenberg's here today. Alex Pomerantz is here today. On the professional side, they get as much credit as anyone for midwifing this very important renovation and relaunching it in its fullness now as we're kind of moving out of the pandemic. Of course, there were many volunteers who are involved, and a number of you were involved in donating generously to make all of this possible. When I think about our community here in Reservoir Hill, we talk about being in, for, and of our neighborhood. And this morning, I actually had an opportunity to be with our Jewish Discovery Lab students doing a walking tour of the community, talking about the Jewish history, the African-American history of this neighborhood, and its wonderful character as a diverse community here in the 21st century, in which Beth plays an important role as an anchor institution, along with a number of other anchors and community partners. On that walk, we had a chance to go stand in the Beth parking lot and talked about how it used to be the Hendler Mansion. And we walked down to the Whitelock Community Farm and talked about the businesses that used to inhabit the commercial district of the neighborhood. And we walked down to Dorothy I. Heights School and talked about School 61 and the evolution of that 21st century school. And we looked out over Baltimore to our south and took in the Marlboro Apartments and the old Utah Place Temple, Ohab Shalom and Baltimore Hebrew congregation that was there, and gave the kids a sense of what does it mean to be a Jewish neighborhood? What happens when a Jewish neighborhood is no longer defined by simply a certain quantity of Jewish institutions or Jews, but it's actually one of a number of different ways of identifying a neighborhood. Can it also be a Jewish neighborhood and a black neighborhood? Can it be a neighborhood for refugees? We have dozens of Afghan refugee families in the neighborhood. There's been an influx of Latino families to the neighborhood in recent years, right? What does it mean to claim space in a community that's shared by different communities that intersect in all kinds of really exciting and mutually reinforcing ways? So that was what we did today, and those are some of the ideas that we explore at Beth in our work now, 100 years in this building and almost 50 years as a congregation. Today you're going to hear about the physical space, about this building on 2501 Utah Place. And to that end, I want to thank some people who have been involved in putting together this centennial celebration. Those include these committee members: Julie Gottlieb, Jackie Freed, TJ Intner, Hillary Jacobs, Jason Katkoff, Joe Nathanson, Evan Serpic, Eileen Saltzman, Clara Salzberg, and Susan Weingast-Brown, Adina Ameth as ex officio member and president of the congregation, and thanks to Anna Pavich, who has been coordinating all of this work, done a wonderful job with each of these three installments. Big round of applause. I was also asked to acknowledge the staff members. I named two of them already, David Rothenberg, our immediate past executive director, and Alex Pomerantz, our current executive director, but also Jamie Aaron, who is until recently our program director, Susanna Kolstad, who now inhabits that position, my colleague, Rabbi Tyler Dratch, Jake Max, as well, who handles our tech. And it's really now my honor to introduce not an outsider. Charlie's not so much of an outsider anyway. I was joking yesterday. I said Charlie's gonna, he's gonna cross North Avenue to come hang out with us in Reservoir Hill, which is great. But Charlie's done a lot of really important work throughout the city, and including here in Central West Baltimore. But Gabriel Croix is an assistant professor of architecture at Morgan State University. He has brought multiple groups of his students over the years into this space to do artistic architectural renderings of the space. Gabriel has been a member for many years. He's here with some of his family members today, and it's my delight to hand the mic over to Gabriel, who's going to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I want to first thank a few people as well. Thank you, Rabbi, and to the committee members that made this possible, and to the staff that made this possible, especially to Joe Nathanson. Do I see you in here? I'm standing in the sunlight. It's a little... There he is, yes. Joe Nathanson. I also, I came with students, and I don't think I see any of them here, but several of them have posters of the drawings they did a couple weeks ago in the synagogue, and they'll be downstairs when we have a reception. And then I'm going to sort of informally introduce Charlie Duff. I had the pleasure of meeting Charlie Duff as a young architect in the 90s when I was first back in Baltimore, and you recruited me to do the Mount Vernon walking tour. And I learned, it kind of opened me up to Baltimore architecture and its history in a way that I didn't learn away at school. And we've continued to have conversations. And I think I've continued to take a lot away from those conversations. Additionally, Charlie's been really generous with our students out at Morgan. He's taught the history of, the urban development of Baltimore as a full course, and he's very often to be found either speaking to a group of students or visiting our class. And I will say I was asked to introduce Charlie, and Joe wrote to us back in August, and a couple weeks ago he wrote us again and said, "Have you all talked?" And I thought, well, what's there to talk about? I introduce and Charlie talks, but we met it on the Hill for, on a beautiful morning at an outdoor table to discuss the lecture, both thinking there's not much to talk about. And 40 minutes later, we were still talking about the building. And out of that, Charlie has asked me to speak a little bit about the building. So Charlie will introduce Joseph Sperry and his work, and I will speak a little bit about the building. And with that, Charlie?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good. Well, this is wonderful. Look around you, or better yet, look at the slide, or better yet, look around you. This is an amazing space. And if I were an architect, I could tell you why it's amazing. Gabe actually is an architect. And Gabe said that just about the first thing I did when I met him was to hornswoggle him into giving walking tours of Baltimore architecture. Apparently, I'm up to my old tricks again, like Tom Sawyer getting Gabe to whitewash my fence. So this is great. So we're going to divide it. I'm going to talk about the 1.5 people who are responsible for what you see around you or on the screen. 1.5 people? What on earth does that mean? Well, you'd better listen. And then maybe you'll find out. And Gabe, who's actually an architect and actually has an eye, can tell you some of the things that he was beginning to tell me the other morning at On the Hill. And I thought, wow, I knew Beth Am was a great room. I knew it was a cool building. But this is why. So nice to have an architect in the house. So at any rate, here we are in Beth Am. You've all seen it from the outside, and you lucky folks who are members of the congregation, have seen it from the inside. And as Rabbi Berg has already told you, this building is now 100 years old. There are mornings when I feel 100 years old, but this building looks a lot better than I do when I feel that way. And which is a good sign, a tribute to the people who built it, and perhaps to the people who designed it, and certainly to those of you who have maintained it and restored it, including my boss, the chairman of the board of Jubilee Baltimore, Ed Hord. So it is good to be in the house of so many of my friends. It's good to cross North Avenue and see so many people who cross North Avenue all the time. It's strange to see Barry and Barbara Blumberg when we're not walking dogs. And so, you know, this is a wonderful, wonderful place to be. And I'm glad to be dressed like Joe Nathanson. If you can't see Joe over there, you don't need to look at him. You can just look at me. So here we are. I'm glad to be in Beth Am. It's wonderful. And I want to thank you for giving me a chance to learn some things I didn't know, and perhaps to share them with you. Not deep, dark secrets about your building. You already know a lot of deep, dark secrets about your building. Gabe can tell you things about your building. I want to tell you about the careers of the people who made this possible. And it starts with this guy, Joseph Evans Sperry. Raise your hand if you've heard of Joseph Evans Sperry. Well, you must be members of Beth Am. Either that or, like David Gleason, you're a past president of the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. So Joseph Evans Sperry, probably not a household word outside this group, was one of the most prominent and prolific architects in the history of Baltimore. Well, what did he design? That's why you keep me around, to tell you what he designed. First, some dates. He's born in 1854, which is 7 years before the outbreak of the Civil War. And he dies in 1930, which is the year after the stock market crash. So apparently it's not safe to be around the birth and death of Joseph Evans Sperry. I don't know. But Joseph Evans Sperry was 7 years old when the Civil War broke out, and my guess is that that mattered a lot to Joseph Evans Sperry because he grew up in the low country of South Carolina, in a town of about 1,500 people called Georgetown, South Carolina. And when Joseph Evans Sperry was born, Georgetown County, South Carolina, produced half of the rice that was grown in the United States. And the little town of Georgetown, 1,500 people, was the world's biggest rice port. I don't know what the world's second biggest rice port was, but I've read that Georgetown was the world's biggest rice port with only 1,500 people. Why did Joseph Evans Sperry come to Baltimore? Well, why not? Because the Civil War completely upended the growing of rice in the low country of South Carolina, threw the whole thing into crisis. And there was basically very, very, very little for anybody to do for a long time. It would also be interesting to know how Joseph Evans Sperry came to be very comfortable with Jews, because boy did he. Georgetown, South Carolina had a very old Jewish congregation. It was Sephardic, and it disbanded after the Civil War and didn't come back together again until it came back together as an Ashkenazi congregation in 1904. I have no idea how Joseph Evans Sperry made connections with Jews in South Carolina or in Baltimore. And in fact, I don't know much about Joseph Evans Sperry as a person. I know what he did, but I would bet you that there is information out there, and if I do my job, it's entirely possible that one of you is going to say, I want to know more about this guy. Those of us at the Baltimore Architecture Foundation are pretty good at helping people to collect information about Baltimore architects and get it out to the public. If you want to write a book, we'll publish it. Joseph Evans Sperry, well, what did he do? He came to Baltimore by about 1876. He was 22 years old, and he went to work for this guy. This is E. Francis Baldwin. And E. Francis Baldwin ran the biggest architectural practice in Victorian Baltimore, hands down. What did Baldwin do? Well, who were his two main clients? He had two main clients, the B&O Railroad and the Roman Catholic Church. And if you're in Victorian Baltimore and you've got the B&O in one pocket and the Roman Catholic Church in the other, you're going to need a lot of young architects to work for you. Baldwin did an enormous amount of work, and many Baltimore architects started their careers in Baldwin's office, including Joseph Evans Sperry, and including a guy named J.B. Noel Wyatt. Wyatt was 3 years older than Sperry. Unlike Sperry, Wyatt was a native Baltimorean, and he was pretty well born. He was a Baltimore society figure, and he was the first Baltimore architect to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which is where you wanted to study if you were a 19th century architect. So in the office of E. Francis Baldwin, Sperry and Wyatt get to know each other, and in 1877 they leave Baldwin's office, they form a business together, Wyatt and Sperry, and they win the competition to design St. Michael and All Angels Church at the corner of St. Paul and 20th Streets, not too far from here. In fact, I can see it from my office window. My office is in 20th Street. So this is their first big commission. It never did get its spire, but that's okay. The spire wasn't very good looking. And it puts this pair of two guys, they're in their 20s. They're starting their business. They get moving. By 1884, they are well established, and they do the Mercantile Deposit and Trust Company at the corner of Redwood and Calvert Streets. If you've been in there, if you walk around it, you'll see it has absolutely fabulous carving detail. I don't know whether Wyatt drew it or Sperry drew it. Maybe they had a draftsman who drew it. And Lord knows who cut it, but boy, is it good. And in 1880, they did the whole west side of the 1000 block of Calvert Street in Mount Vernon. Belvedere Terrace, probably the most beautiful block of Victorian houses in the United States. And this side had a very, very good builder, a guy named Charles Blake. I'm Charles Blake Duff Jr. That was my great-grandfather. So, you know, and I'm sure that my great-grandfather actually could have told me a lot of things about Joseph Evans Sperry. We should get in a dark room and put our hands down on the table. So, and if you've been in the Mercantile building lately, you'll know it now looks like this. It's the Chesapeake Shakespeare Company. And if you haven't been in there lately, you should go. They put on good plays. So in 1884, Wyatt and Sperry go their separate ways. And Wyatt goes off with a guy named Knowlting and has a completely separate career and designs things like this: the courthouse, the Roland Park Shopping Center, the Kaiser Building, a very, very important major Baltimore architecture firm from about 1885 until about 1933. But Sperry's not involved in that one, so we'll let Wyatt go off and have his fun. Sperry teams up with another brilliant, really brilliant young architect, a guy named Charles Carson. Charles Carson's about the same age. He is from Baltimore. He is, among other things, the local representative of McKim, Mead, and White, working on Lovely Lane Church, Goucher College, what's now the Engineers Club, what's now, 1217 St. Paul Street, the Winans Mansion. And they go nuts. They do some Carson had already done some great things. He had already done the Mount Vernon Place Methodist Church. He had already done, that is the Opera House in Wilmington, Delaware, which is really quite a wonderful piece of work. And down under it is what's now the Engineers Club, what was then the Robert Garrett House, and Carson had been the local man for McKim, Mead, and White working on that. When they get together, their first big building, 1891, is the first big steel-framed skyscraper in Baltimore's history, built as an investment by the Equitable Life Assurance Company and known as the Equitable Building. Baltimoreans had been confused for a very long time because this was the Equitable Building, and right across the street in a different building was the Equitable Trust Company, which was hard for Baltimoreans to understand. At least when I was a kid, it was hard for me to understand. So at any rate, this was Baltimore's first big skyscraper, very fancy. Up on the roof, it had a French restaurant with waiters, and I wish I could find my picture of it. 1891, there is the detail of it. They are off building big buildings. Well, it is at this time that Sperry's professional engagement with Jewish congregations begins. And Sperry becomes the first architect in 45 years to design a major Baltimore synagogue. Here is what we would think of as Baltimore Hebrew, now Lloyd Street Synagogue, part of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, designed in 1845 by Robert Carey Long, Jr. This, as of 1891, this was the newest fancy Jewish synagogue in Baltimore. It was in 1891 that the congregation of Baltimore Hebrew, staring death in the face, their membership had fallen off dramatically, decided to throw a long bomb to the end zone. You're going to have to tell me if Jews can do a Hail Mary, but at any rate, they did a Hail Mary. So, I don't know what Brandeis football is like, but so there you go. They do a Hail Mary. They buy a plot of ground in a developing, fashionable neighborhood that has few or no Jewish residents. And they borrow a bunch of money, put up a bunch of money, and say, maybe if we build it, they will come. And they build the Madison Avenue Temple of Baltimore Hebrew, which is, I think, the only building in the whole history of Baltimore architecture that actually looks like a stegosaurus. It's quite amazing. And the architect is Joseph Evans Sperry. How did Joseph Evans Sperry get that commission? There's something fun for you to investigate. That would be fun. I'd love to know that, but I want you to find it out for me and tell me. You don't have to look at archival photographs. It's there every day, not far from here, other side of North Avenue, but we're liberal here. It's now Berea Seventh-day Adventist Church. Seventh-day Adventists have a wonderful hymnal, incidentally, if you're curious. And it still looks like a stegosaurus. And enormous Romanesque details. If you'll remember something about medieval architecture, there are basically two flavors of medieval architecture. First, there's Romanesque, and then there's Gothic. And Romanesque is round, and Gothic is pointy. And Romanesque capitals are all curly-cued, and Gothic are all fluty. Well, this is Romanesque, but Romanesque very free. And if you want to know why architecture is so free in 1891, that's a separate talk. But, and there's nothing quite like the Madison Avenue Temple. It can have, on a gray afternoon from a distance, it has a kind of a moody splendor. But it's still, I think, a very, very odd building. And if this were the only building that Joseph Evans Sperry had ever designed, I'm not sure I would have put some time into organizing a slide talk for you. I would have thought, well, this is weird, but I have better things to do. He got better. In 1891, there's a breakthrough year for Sperry. He gets hired to renovate the first Unitarian church, which is at the corner of Charles and Franklin Streets. The Unitarian church was built in 1817, and when it was new, it looked exactly like that. The outside hasn't changed a bit. You'll notice it has a dome. That dome looked like this and was a problem. The acoustics were terrible. Apparently, you couldn't hear the sermon beyond the third row. And it was a Unitarian church, so there's not much to do except listen to the sermon. And it was a real problem. And in 1891, Enoch Pratt, who was a member of the congregation, put up enough money to do something about it. They hired Joseph Evans Sperry, and he did this. He created a big barrel vault. It is unrecognizable from the 1817 interior. Don't try to say, gee, did this survive, did that survive? Nothing survived, except that everything survived. And the coolest, weirdest space in Baltimore today is above the ceiling of the Unitarian Church, because that dome is still there. And it's like being in a Roman catacomb, but you're 30 feet above Charles Street. And they don't often let people up, but if they let you up, go. It's wonderful. So then, the next year, he got a commission to design a new home for Oheb Shalom. And this is what Oheb Shalom was between 1857 and 1892. Oheb was down in Hanover Street, in the middle of Hopkins Plaza today. And the building had been built as a Presbyterian church. Oheb Shalom bought it in 1857. The rabbi was Benjamin Zold, the father of Henrietta Zold. Benjamin Zold was from Breslau in East Prussia. He preached in German. And as long as he was the rabbi, services were in German, and the congregation was in Hanover Street. He retired in 1891, and the congregation hired somebody who shook the place up. He preached in English, and he said, we've got to get out of here. Baltimore Hebrew has shown us that if we can get up into northwest Baltimore, we will increase our congregation. So they bought a lot out not far from the Madison Avenue Temple and built the Utah Place Temple, 1892, and their architect is Joseph Evans Sperry. How did he get the commission? You tell me. I think there's got to be a story there. But he did get it. Where did he get his ideas? How about the Grand Synagogue of Nuremberg? Kind of looks like that. The first time I saw a picture of this, I said, looks like Oheb, but the house on the left is kind of weird. What is that? This is the Grand Synagogue of Nuremberg, which was destroyed on Kristallnacht. Gabriel will also tell you about the big synagogue in Rome, I think? Florence, that looks like it. Standard pattern. So there's a lot of that in the design of the Utah Place Temple. But there are some other things too. Sperry was from Baltimore, and by this time, Oheb is in English. And the members of the congregation, they're from Baltimore too. And Baltimore has a principal religious building with 2 cupolas on the front, some columns, and a dome. And Sperry is in the middle of restoring First Unitarian, which has these 3 arches and doors on the inside. And he builds the Utah Place Temple, and it has basically the skyline of a different version of the basilica, and the entrance of a different version of the Unitarian Church. And if you look at the doors, there's the Unitarian Church, that's how you get in. This is the Utah Place Temple, that's how you get in. The same guy is working on both of these buildings in the same year. And he's learning, and his congregation likes this. So a couple of years later, 1894, He does a new Har Sinai, which is in Bolton Street, where Fitzgerald Park now is. He does an office for the Baltimore Herald. I don't think that's particularly Jewish, but it's a beautiful building, burned in the Great Fire, and it's famous because of this guy. Here is the 20-year-old city editor of the Baltimore Herald, H.L. Mencken, sitting in a building that was designed by Joseph Evans Sperry and was about to burn down. And then he begins his association with Congregation Hizakomuno. Hizakomuno was worshiping in what's now Bnei Israel. Hizakomuno built this building in 1876. And by 1894, they saw which way the wind was blowing. They bought a piece of ground out in northwest Baltimore in the newly developing fashionable district. By now it's 1894. They're 3 years behind Baltimore Hebrew. They're 2 years behind Oheb Shalom. And they buy a somewhat smaller lot in McCullough Street at the corner of Mosher and build a new Hizakomuno to the designs of Joseph Evans Sperry. I read the history of Hizakomuno for you, and I can tell you that the official history gives absolutely no information on how they picked their architect. It's something for you to find out and tell me. So this is now Metropolitan Baptist Church. It still exists. If you're wondering, you've got one kind of stone in the front and another kind of stone on the side. When the building was built, there were houses on the side, and you couldn't see that wall. So why did they use a different kind of stone on the wall you couldn't see? I would suggest that it's because they hadn't yet invented vinyl siding. You can tell that one stone must have been pretty dramatically cheaper than the other. So in the 1890s, by the mid-1890s, the biggest project going on in Baltimore is the new courthouse. There was a big competition which Sperry did not win. His old partner Wyatt won it in 1894, and the courthouse was under construction from 1895 until 1901, and was the biggest public commission in Baltimore and was nationally famous for all kinds of reasons, and that'll be another talk. Why it comes into the Sperry talk is this. 1896, the Brewers Exchange, which is over just beyond the arena in Park Avenue. And where did he get the idea for that? Well, look at these columns with the inset wall and windows behind them, flanked by little projections with a solid cornice above, very elaborate frieze. Whoops. And now look back at the courthouse. The brewers of the Brewers Exchange, I think, liked the courthouse. And they said, Mr. Sperry, we want something that looks like that. Of course, we're not going to be sentencing people to be hanged by the neck until dead. We just want to get them drunk, so it's not going to be as big or as expensive. So can you do something like that for us? And he said, why, sure, and did the Brewers Exchange, which is still there at number 20 Park Avenue. He does St. Mark's Lutheran Church at the corner of St. Paul and 20th. This is a very severe Romanesque building on the outside. On the inside, it is the biggest wangdoodle of Victorian interiordom in Baltimore. The congregation hired the Tiffany Studio in 1897 when the building was new, and they stuck with Tiffany until they were finished in 1933. And if you want to see an interior that is the absolute antithesis of your own interior that we're sitting in right now, go to St. Mark's. Everything here is light. Everything there is dark. This is the only picture I could find that really makes it visible. But it's something. It's really odd and something. When you were talking about schools, Rabbi, here is School 49, where many of my elderly Jewish friends were students. Were some of you students there? Anybody go there? Okay, yep. Now part of the Med Chi down near the Symphony Hall. Joseph Evans Sperry, 1899. the Providence Savings Bank. You don't want to break into that. That is a fortress-like Florentine Renaissance building. It's a little bit of Palazzo Medici stuck at the corner of Howard and Saratoga Streets in 1904. We're up to 1904 by now. One of the grandest houses in Baltimore, built for the 3 children of Charles Marburg at number 8 East Eager Street, right across the street from the Maryland Club. It looks very plain and decorous on the outside. On the inside, it is unimaginably elaborate. And when the Marburgs wanted a house that was grand and decent at the same time, Joseph Evans Sperry. You didn't know anything about Joseph Evans Sperry? These are buildings we've all been seeing all our lives. And they came from the same pencil as Beth. He did at least one Pratt Library over by Patterson Park, a nice piece of work. Hochschild Kohn, not there anymore, but if you remember Baltimore's own Hochschild Kohn, it is a work of Joseph Evans Sperry, or was, and he became the architect for this guy. Do you know who this is? This is one of the owner of one of the 3 biggest collections of art that went to form the BMA. This is Jacob Epstein, a Lithuanian immigrant who lived on my side of Utah Place and collected art. He was the biggest wholesaler in the South, and Joseph Evans Sperry built Jacob Epstein's Baltimore Bargain House. If you were a retailer in the coastal South, twice a year, Jacob Epstein would charter a steamboat, and he would take you to Baltimore and back for nothing, and you didn't have to buy anything from the Baltimore Bargain House. He was just confident that when you got to Baltimore, you would find that he had the best things for the best prices. And apparently it worked, because that's a very, very big building, Mr. Sperry, from 1911, now the Maryland Department of Education. He did one loft factory over in the Loft District. On one side is 1888, and on the other side is 1905. He did both halves. And he did the first academic building on the campus of Johns Hopkins University. This is Maryland Hall, 1914, designed by Joseph Evans Sperry. I don't know why, and then he had 2 great professional relationships. One was somehow with Jewish Baltimore. The other was Captain Isaac Emerson, the inventor of bromo-seltzer. And he somehow became the house architect for Captain Emerson. And this was a lot of work for an architect, most famously. This is probably the most famous building that Joseph Evans Sperry ever did. In my humble opinion, it's probably the worst, but he had a very strong-willed client and was good at giving the client what the client wanted. And as you may know, when it was new, it was surmounted by a bromo-seltzer bottle lighted from the outside. This thing was 52 feet high and was visible from God knows where, space, I would think. But so this is Captain Isaac Emerson, the inventor of bromo-seltzer. Can you still buy bromo-seltzer? Does it still exist? I should have Googled that, but one day they say Captain Emerson was having lunch at the Belvedere. It was hot. He took off his jacket. A waiter came over and said, "I'm sorry, sir, you need to keep your jacket on." And Emerson said, "I'm going to build a hotel where I can take my jacket off if I want." And he did. He built the Hotel Emerson at the corner of Baltimore and where is it? Calvert, Calvert. He bought the old B&O building and built the Emerson, which I remember, and was a big thing. Looks like the Belvedere, doesn't it? So, and he built the Emersonian, which is right across the street from you. I can't find any evidence that he did the Esplanade. I don't know who did. Maybe he did, but I haven't found any evidence that he did. He did, however, build Captain Emerson's summer place at Narragansett Pier in Rhode Island, a place that has burnt down. Too bad, because my best friend lives about half a mile away, and I could go scope it out without having to pay a hotel room. But, Captain Emerson wanted something that looked like the White House, and Joseph Evans Sperry gave it to him. And curiously, Captain Emerson had had 7 houses in various parts of the world, including a plantation called Arcadia. And Joseph Evans Sperry fixed up Arcadia so that it no longer looked like this. And where was it? Where is it? It's in Georgetown, South Carolina, Joseph Evans Sperry's hometown. Emerson was from North Carolina. Something was going on here. I don't know what. You tell me. Union Memorial Hospital, you've all been through there. I spent 6 weeks there when I was 2 in traction. Got out, I can still walk. Western High School, now Douglas. These are works of Joseph Evans Sperry, your architect. The Baltimore Country Club. I thought that was Wyatt and Knowlton. It isn't. It's Joseph Evans Sperry. And that brings us home, brings us to you, to Beth, outside and inside. But it's not the last thing he did for the Baltimore Jewish community. As far as I can tell, this is the last thing he did, period. The last building designed by Joseph Evans Sperry, and it's the YMHA on Monument Street. My guess is that it was designed to be taller than it is. But the year is 1930, and there isn't as much money as there had been when the building was designed. What would it have looked like? You tell me. This is a subject waiting to be discovered. Now, Joe asked me to say something about this guy, and I will, and I'll do it quickly. This guy had absolutely nothing to do with building your building, but he had everything to do with building your building. He died 14 years before your building was built, but his sons built all of this with the technology that their dad brought over from Catalonia in Spain. This is a fellow named Guastavino, Rafael Guastavino. He was a maker of tiles in Catalonia. And if you don't know anything about the architecture of Catalonia, this is where Antoni Gaudi came from, and there is some wang-doodly design and construction in Catalonia. Here's the Casa Mila. Up in the attic, look at these amazing arches. These arches are made of thin tiles, a traditional Catalan building technique that looks like this. You can build an arch like that without a lot of structure. Rafael Guastavino brought this technology to America in 1881, when he was 40 years old. He rather quickly, and it's still going in Catalonia. Here is part of the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, a picture that I took this year. And this part of Sagrada Familia was just finished a couple of years ago. Catalans are still building this way. But Rafael Guastavino isn't building in Catalonia. First of all, he's been dead for 114 years. But second, he came to America and wound up doing all the vaults in the Boston Public Library. McKim, Mead and White, big building, wonderful stuff like this. And underneath all of this is what you have, is Guastavino tile, Catalan tile construction, the Boston Public Library. It puts him on the map. Here is the Oyster Bar at Grand Central Station in New York. Quite an amazing symphony of Catalan tile. Here is the New York subway station under New York City Hall. It's closed. You can't get off or on there. You'll go through it as a train is going around. But isn't that the most spectacular subway station in America? I think New Yorkers should reopen it. And there is now a restaurant called Guastavino's underneath one of the New York bridges where Guastavino had tiled the stuff back at the turn of the century. Guastavino had been dead for 14 years by the time your building was built. But he had a couple of boys, and they kept the business going and became a very, very important national construction company, and somehow teamed up with Joseph Evans Sperry to build the room where we are right now. How was that team made? You tell me. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think,
That was a full screen. Let me just, if you don't mind.
oh, thank you. Hello again. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the dome, and I'll do a couple disclaimers. One, I'm not a historian, more an architect, so I generally look at these things and try and understand the decision-making process behind them, and maybe I can do that with this space. And two, I'm not impartial. I've been coming to this space since probably before I could read, when it was Chizuk, and then when it was Beth, and heard people like Cantor Weisgall and Dr. Kaplan, who bar mitzvahed me, and I watched my kids then run around. And I don't think that I always thought about the architecture. I mean, I don't remember thinking about it when I was this high and running around the shul, but I know after coming back from architecture school, it was the same, kind of the same room and the same service, and my mind would wander, and I have spent more than a few minutes center balcony looking out at the space and thinking about the vaults the space, and generally think that it's really, you know, it's really great. It's a really great space. It kind of seems just right. And that's a sort of like my mom's cooking might seem just right, but you know, if you spend enough time here, it wears on you. But I thought I'd sort of explore that a little, and maybe it's somewhere between sort of a hunch and a thesis. I don't think it's a thesis yet. But and what I'm showing here is the original drawing section for the proposal of the synagogue. And it's got something on it that we might not expect. It actually has a dome on it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of building type, where we have 4 arches that support a dome. And our version, which isn't a dome, which is actually a groin vault, 2 arches or 2 vaults that intersect. And I spoke with a colleague of mine, and sort of his response was, of course, this is just value engineering, which is what sort of architects say, the kind of compromise that happens when their design ideas meet a budget and they have to cut somehow. But I don't know that I was fully satisfied with that. As I said, I'm partial to the synagogue. I've been sitting here thinking it's just right for a pretty long time. And I also tend to think that just like good editing makes for good writing, I think this value engineering process often really benefits a building. So I just push like that. Excellent. So just, I mean, this might be familiar, it might not for the architects in the room, I'm sure it is. But on the left, we have a few basic structural shapes that we get from the Romans. So before the Romans, we didn't have arches. They give us that. And you can see the first shape is the arch, and the second shape is a vault, which is an extruded arch and can cover more space. And let light in at both ends. And then the third shape, which resembles what we're in, is a groin vault. It's when you take 2 vaults and intersect them. And it's, well, it's something that we don't, actually Charlie and I, when we met to discuss the talk and went on, he dragged me back to his house where you own a copy that's this big of the Great Synagogues of Europe with hundreds of illustrations, and we could not find a groin vault as a sacred space, sort of standalone. They always sort of sat below a dome, but never was it the main event. So we might be unique in that. I've been looking and I've yet to find this configuration as a synagogue, and certainly I haven't been in it yet. And it's interesting, the Romans get all the way to the dome, but they don't actually manage to put the dome on top of the vaults like we would have seen in the Sperry design. So I'm showing a diagram where you can see the dome is sits on top of 4 vaults, and you have to introduce this piece called the pendentive that connects from the walls to the dome above, that resolves that. And then I'm showing this, and really, doesn't that look a lot like the space we're in? And it's, did we just get a structural diagram? It's kind of ironic because we got a structural diagram, and as you mentioned, the roof above us, which looks believably structural, completely isn't. It's a thin shell tile on stucco suspended from the roof, and you can go up above it, and it's probably a sandwich of materials this thick, and it hangs. But I think it's important, the spatial ideas do come from 2 millennia of structural design and structural design for sacred spaces. I don't know that I can attribute it to the Hagia Sophia, but this is certainly an example after Rome where we see the dome on top of the arches, and we know that it plays a continuing influence and how this shape and how it sort of makes it to Baltimore. And I think a little bit about how this set of shapes, the original design with the dome, makes its way into synagogue architecture. The next place we see this configuration, or not the next place, but I'll just jump, but it's famous. This is St. Peter's in Rome, the Vatican, and we would see 4 vaults, a dome, and the pendentives that connect them. And I'm going to go to the Great Synagogue of Florence rather than Nuremberg. In the Great Synagogue of Florence, you can start to see, you can see it on the outside, the 4 arches that come together, and you can see the dome that sits on top, as well as the 2 minarets out front. And to some extent brings ideas from the Hagia Sophia to Florence, and puts together the fact that you could find your example in Nuremberg and I could find it in Florence means this is a type that's repeated. Unlike what we have, unlike our groin vault, which we just don't, not that it doesn't exist, I just don't know that it exists yet. And this gets us to, you called it Ohev Shalom, I'll call it the Utah Place Temple. But this gets us to the Utah Place Temple, and we can see these elements in Sperry's work coming to Baltimore. And I've been in this space, but I don't have photographs and couldn't readily, they weren't internet available. I don't know, I think that it's a fabulous piece from the outside, and I think it's an okay piece from the inside, but my experience, and maybe some of you have been in there, my experience is that the dome doesn't do a great job lighting the space, and it's really high. It's well out of our sort of field of vision. And The other thing that I would offer is a sort of a critique is that in order to light the space, since the dome's not doing this work, the outside windows are doing this work. And notice how we look at what was the bema and it's now, the bema of this, and it's backlit by a giant window. I don't know about you, but I don't know that I think the glare of the window and the main event are a really good contrast. And then I'm again going to go through the Chizuk Emunah shuls, and this of course is B'nai Israel, and it is a simpler affair. It's a smaller affair. It's basically a basilica. There's a center aisle and 2 side aisles with balconies. I think that it's interesting, and you see this, well, a couple things. One, over half of the congregation either sits under or on a balcony. So this center space is a pretty small space, which I think has repercussions for how we socialize, sort of how we interact. And I think that we see as synagogues grew, we're in a synagogue where you can see the balconies, and underneath the balconies are relatively tiny compared to the main space. We all sit in a square space, and there's almost a continuity between the seats here, the seats there, the seats in the balcony. Something that brings us, the architecture of this interior brings us together, not separate. And we've managed to do this without bringing columns, which these are kind of nice for balcony columns, but you'll see in other examples, they can be big. They create multiple spaces. This again is the McCullough Street Temple, and it's the second one, and it's interesting because you can see the balcony. There's something on top of it in the current picture, but you can see the balcony, the columns, the sort of style has changed. The roof is coffered and more classical. It's not a shallow dome. There's sort of a higher level of ornament throughout the project, but it's a sort of similar as a type. And then I wanted to show where we ended up. So Beth, this would have been Chizuk Emunah's congregation, and Chizuk Emunah would have moved, or did move, to Stevenson Road and built a campus that would have a large religious school, a large sanctuary, and I'm not going to say that and they built sort of a box as the main sanctuary. It works, it houses a lot of people, but it doesn't necessarily have this kind of imagery that we see above us. And I don't know if this is a sort of straw poll of these things, but when you look on the internet for interior photographs of this synagogue, they come up in mass. I had to find this picture of the interior of Chizuk Emunah on an Etsy site from someone selling an original photo. So somehow, I don't know, but the people who are here sort of spend a fair amount of time saying this is pretty great and sharing it online. And then I wanted to go on. So to some extent, I think that we get the best of the Chizuk Emunah 4 buildings. And I also think that it's quite wonderful. Chizuk Emunah moved and left their cantor Weisgall here, and the older resident, I learned this from my mom last night, but and left the older residents of the left this synagogue, and Weisgall and the residents of the neighborhood continued it, and kind of quite wonderfully continued it for long enough, over a decade, till Dr. Kaplan and the founders of Beth were able to, actually on Weisgall's passing, were able to purchase the building and continue its use as a synagogue, which is sort of a great outcome. I guess I wanted to show this. These are my sketches of the interior of the First Unitarian Church, and I don't know that I was thinking about it. I was in the, I went to a lecture there and spent the lecture drawing the interior, and you can see the vault, and we know that it's a Sperry building, and it was really wonderful. The person that tends it invited me up above the shell dome, above this, to see the dome above, because there's this incongruous dome above and a vault below, and there it is, and you can see the dome is intact, and there's been the scaffolding. Our ceiling is suspended by steel, but a similar idea that there's a scaffolding above the vault that holds it up is what sits in that space today. And I should go, I meant to go, I should say that if we look at this building, it has a lot of it has some similarities that are worth mentioning to the design for the first design. If notice it's a square plan, like we're in a square plan. The 4 columns here, the space we're in is a square, and it has shallow balconies on 3 sides and the altar on the 4th side, and it had a dome on it. It's kind of interesting that, having repaired one of these early in his career, it's kind of interesting that the original proposal for Beth would have even been this configuration of a dome, especially knowing that it would be used for speaking and singing. I think, and I'm not an acoustic engineer, but my guess is that what the dome does is spread out the reverb time that probably just collapses the ability of us to recognize articulate human speech, and it might be great for music, but not so good for speaking. I did want to show you, and this is as close as I can get to something that this is the University Baptist Church on University Parkway, and it's by John Russell Pope, the architect of the BMA and also the National Gallery. And this is looking up at the dome, and you can see it very much probably is like the space that would have been originally conceived. It is a dome over 4 relatively simple arches. And here we can see the interior. But again, and I've been there, and I've only been there to draw, and I haven't been there to hear music or speaking. I've been there, and the dome isn't a big light contributor. In fact, as the surface of the dome gets higher, it gets further away and harder to light. There's something about the groin vault that's interesting. The top of the window is really close to the top of the arch, is really close to the highest point anywhere in the ceiling. So I have this feeling that, so this is perhaps what we would have had without, had we not faced a cost-cutting session. But I think what we ended up with has a few things worth remarking on. One, the walls are as high as the space, which puts the windows about as high up as they can go, which means that we actually really have fantastic light. I did not point it out in the earlier drawing, but the earlier sections for this space show what look like masonry walls below and a plastered ceiling above. And I can't verify that that was exactly the intention, but it certainly looks like that. And I think this switch that got made, let's say it's a switch, but a switch to put the masonry sort of canopy above and the white walls that do a great job of bouncing the light around, works really well. And I think there's something very cogent about it. And if we looked at I didn't show the interior of the earlier, well, we could think of Hagia Sophia and the sort of crazy amount of decoration and patterning and stuff like that. And I think that there's something quite wonderful in the sort of organization of a seating zone, 4 walls that bring in light, a canopy that does a good job with acoustics, and I didn't go into it, but a bema that reminds us of the Second Temple, or the last extant temple. Thank you. And at this point, should we go up? And there's a mic, and you can ask one or either of us questions.
So, thank you, everyone, thank you, Charlie, thank you, Gabriel, if you can
Do you want to join me?
Join you.
Thank you. So we would open the floor to the audience for any questions. I'll come to you, Sandy. Wait.
In 1947, my parents were looking for a synagogue to go to, and I was 8 years old at the time, and they came to Chizuk Emunah in this building for a Friday night service. And when they came home, they said to my brother and me, "I feel like I died and went to heaven." And the Sunday morning, they brought me and my brother up to the office. They joined the synagogue, and I went to Hebrew school in this building for 6 years. And then I grew up, went away to college, and when I came back from college after 4 years, Chizuk Emunah had left without consulting me and my family to Stevenson. My parents joined, of course, they bought a house out there, and were active members until they died. I don't know if there's anybody else here who went to Hebrew school in this building for all those years. But at one point, I don't know how many people know this, but at one point, the synagogue, or the Hebrew school, got too big, and we moved some of the classes to the building at the corner of Whitelock. That's also a historic building. And I don't know what it is now. It was an Islamic center at one time, and it was also a nursing home. It's at the corner of Whitelock and Utah Place. Anybody else?
Anyone else? Oh, here you go, Carla.
An architectural and design discussion of acoustics in barrel vaults versus domes versus flat ones, because as someone who's sung with the choir and been aware of how sound goes here, before the advent of microphones that fill all the dead spaces, how did it work at the time when Sperry and the gentleman who did the vaulting, how did it work for acoustics?
I'm afraid you might know more about the acoustics of this space than I ever could by singing in here. How would they have designed it? Is that your question?
Well, you tell. Am I on? Yeah, I'm on. Gabe and I and everybody speaking this morning, we've had these little squawk boxes. You have all probably heard people talking here without squawk boxes. How does it work? Is it good? Does it work? Yeah. I'm turning off my squawk box. Andrew Coletta, can you hear me? Better with the squawk box, okay. Andy Johnson says, mezzo, mezzo, didn't want to hear me anyway. That's all right, yeah.
What happens in a space like this, however, is acoustically designing for two things. One, speaking, which likes a 1 to 2 second reverb time, and one is music, which prefers a 3 or 4 second reverb time. And I think that I think that we do a wonderful job on musical reverb times. And I don't think we do a bad job on acoustic reverb times, but I think our old sound system did a bad job of navigating the space. Now that's total conjecture, but it's sort of how I understand it.
Yeah. If I could just make a comment before Joe jumps in. I think the answer to Carla's question is there was several generations of highly bombastic rabbis.
But were there bombastic cantors?
Hello?
Hello?
So it didn't seem like Sperry had a singular design approach. Was it always a matter of what the client wanted, or did he feel comfortable with a particular style?
The question is, did Sperry have a particular style to which he was loyal, or was it just a question of what the client wanted? You tell me. I mean, you've seen a lot of his buildings today. What do they have in common? What are the threads that run through them? I think the clearest thing I can say about Sperry is that the buildings he designs look like similar American buildings built at roughly the same time. He's not unique. Architectural styles change very rapidly between 1870 and 1930. And not just once, they change several times, and there are lots of influences coming in. At the very bare minimum, Sperry is alive to those changes and knows how to deal with them. To what extent he's innovating, I don't know. But by the time Sperry comes along, there are weekly architectural magazines that show an architect what the latest things are all over the United States. And so you will notice that after the Civil War, a bank in Baltimore tends to look like a bank in Kansas City, and a church in Baltimore may well look like a church in Omaha. The houses may look really different because the houses don't get published in magazines, but the big public buildings get published in magazines, and we develop national approaches to them. Some places are better at them than others, some people are better at them than others, but there are national approaches. Sperry, I think, was pretty good at it. I'm 30 years ago, a lot of us, drew the names of Baltimore's architects out of a hat, and each of us promised to become the world's foremost living expert on the architect that we drew. I didn't draw Sperry. I drew a guy named J. Appleton Wilson, and I am the world's foremost living expert on J. Appleton Wilson. But I have come through this with pretty high respect for Sperry as a designer. The remodeling that he did at the Unitarian Church is brilliant. Your synagogue, in my opinion, is brilliant. This is just a brilliant building. And where it came from, it doesn't seem to be much like anything else that he did. How did he collaborate with the Guastavino firm? Boy, I would like to know that. Did the dome go away merely because domes are expensive? Maybe. But maybe somebody else had an idea. Somebody said, I've just been to the Oyster Bar at Grand Central Station and I wish we could have a ceiling like that. These things happen. You don't know, it would be nice to know who was on the building committee. Again, I've read the official history of Hizikamuna. It doesn't talk about this stuff at all, and I wish it did. And there are all kinds of basic things that I would want to know that you probably know that would help me to understand whether this is a good building. Here's one. In 1922, would a conservative synagogue have had services on Saturday morning? Or were they all on Friday night? Because the light on Saturday morning is dramatically different from the light on Friday night. And if you are in the Utah Place corridor, where the streets run at a 45-degree angle to the vert, you're not a slave to the sun. You can play with the sun. And the sun comes at different places and different times. You know, I think that, as Gabe pointed out, down at the Utah Place Temple, I would think it was a bad idea to put a giant window at the east end of the building. Because, you know, if you're sitting there and trying to see what's going on here, you have to wear sunglasses. But if it's Friday night, everything is different. So that's the kind of thing you would want to know when you're critiquing a design.
So I have a question about the dome versus the groin vaults and the lights, as you were just talking about. Is it a happy coincidence that the building has the groin vault so that the windows could be as they are and the light is created as it is? Or if it had been a regular dome, would the light be terribly different in the building because of that?
So I think what would have happened is that surface that's, we're in a square and that center part's like a cube. And the dome would have made that twice as high, literally, which would have put that surface that's now bouncing light sort of just that much further away from us. Would it have seemed dark? I think how the dome reads depends a lot on how it's proportioned. For instance, the Utah Street Temple is a small dome relative to the space it covers. The neat thing about the University Baptist Church is that it actually touches the four sides of that space. And it would have, it probably, I don't know that it would have taken away. And I think if it would have made sense if it was stuccoed. But somehow this ceiling does a really good job because it's not far away from its light.
So we're going to take one more question. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. And right after that, we're going to have a dedication of a beautiful painting. And then everyone is invited downstairs. We have some desserts and some coffee, and you can sit and schmooze for a while. I'm sure that Gabriel and Charlie will be downstairs, and you can ask questions then. So I just wanted to kind of give you what we're going to be doing. Thanks.
So first a comment and then a question for Charlie. Having been in this building during the day, in the morning, in the afternoon, and at night, I imagine Sperry didn't have the benefit of light meters to see what the light was like on the sanctuary level, but it's really hard to see a book at night here. But maybe people in the 1920s had better eyesight than we do. So I was curious about the evolution from the original design, which showed a prominent dome, to what we have now. And sir, you said you read Hizakamuna's history, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Was Sperry designing for the rabbi, who often could be very influential in design, or was he working with a committee of lay leaders?
Wouldn't you like to know? They don't.
I would.
Yeah, they don't tell you. And it's a nice book. Most parish histories don't tell you that, and congregational histories don't tell you that either. It's what you want to know, and they never tell you.
Great. So now I want to introduce Adina Ameth, our president, who's going to make a short presentation and introduce.
Can you hear me? Okay. Good afternoon. It's really nice to be here speaking about beautiful things, our beautiful synagogue, and we're going to continue the discussion of beautiful things. And before I talk about another beautiful thing, I want to introduce the beautiful people who will talk about the next beautiful thing. I have nicknames for people that they're sort of sometimes secretive, but I'll share one now. Sometimes I call Lisa and Don Auction Dayenu. Like, if they had just given so many years to Beth Dayenu. If one of them had just served as president, Dayenu. If both of them, Lisa and Don Auction, had given so much of themselves to be presidents of Beth Dayenu. If they had just been generous donors to Beth Dayenu. They've given so much in time, years, generous contributions to Beth And a few years ago, I don't know exactly how, but they discovered a wonderful local artist, Jesse DeSantis. And instead of indulging themselves and buying something for themselves, they decided to buy something for Beth And that painting is what we'll dedicate today, and we welcome the artist, who Lisa and Don will say more about, or one of them will say more about. But I want to say that in addition to this beautiful building, we now have a new office building. It's not of the same grandeur, but it's a really important part of the expanding home of Beth And part of our mission was to make that office building look like it belonged to Beth aesthetically and in style. And I think it's been really successful. But another part of it is to make it feel inside like it's part of Beth And this painting will allow that to happen. That is where I spend a lot of my time these days. And so that's where the painting will be. And I want to introduce and thank Lisa and Don.
Thank you, Adina. And you know, Don and I are also very inspired by the dedication of the Amos Smith family to Beth as well. So we've been here for a while celebrating the 100th anniversary of this wonderful building. I think the building, often is what makes that first fabulous impression on each of us when we come in and decide to affiliate with Beth And I know also for Don and I, the location in Reservoir Hill and the commitment of the neighborhood to commitment of the synagogue to Reservoir Hill is also a big part of that. And you're going to see that I am not a millennial here. Okay. And so when we thought about, we were in and out of the building for a period of time and thinking a lot about the building and designing the renovation and the office building. And during that time, we became aware of the work of Jesse DeSantis, who at that time was living in Reservoir Hill. And Jesse is with us today and will help us unveil the painting in a moment. We became aware of her work when she did a beautiful rendering of the arch on Madison Street that was at the entrance of Druid Hill Park. And we thought, as we think about the location of Beth in Reservoir Hill, and we think about the next 100 years of Beth it would be wonderful to have an artist who knows this neighborhood, who's part of this neighborhood, do a rendering of what does Beth look like from the neighborhood's perspective and from this particular artist's perspective. And Jesse, as an artist, I think is very influenced by her family's lineage, origins in Nicaragua. Jessie herself grew up in Miami, and if you go to her website, you'll see that her work is very, very inspired by culture and by heritage. But it was a bit different to think about asking her to capture a synagogue, a very different kind of community. But she found that point of intersection. And I want to read to you the artist's statement that she's given us to hang in the office next to this work, which is titled House of the People. She says, an artist of the Central American diaspora and a Reservoir Hill neighbor, I painted this interpretation of Beth Am with respect for an historic Jewish community that has shown up in solidarity for migrant rights in recent years. My spirit tells me that the work continues towards liberation of all peoples and that we are all sacred, that we must continue to show up for each other and our communities here in Reservoir Hill, that Black Lives Matter, and that we trust, listen, and center voices and experiences different from our own. And with that, I'm going to ask Jesse and Don to come up and introduce us to House of the People, and then we will all celebrate downstairs. And thank you so much, Jesse, for your work. And clearly, Joseph Evans Sperry's lighting is hitting just in the right places here. So thank you, and happy birthday, happy centennial to Beth Am.
Just two more things. I want to thank everyone who put this on, our celebration of 100 years. Anna Pavich, who's been the chair of all of our 100-year celebration. Susanna Kolstad, who helped put this all together today and helped with all the other events. When you go downstairs, there's coffee, dessert. Please go down, enjoy. And also, as Rabbi Berg mentioned, Gabriel is an associate professor at Morgan State. He brings his kids here, his students here, to actually draw. And he did that a few weeks ago, right? It was a few weeks ago. And we have the drawings downstairs in the room that the kids from Morgan State actually drew. So make sure that you take a look at those as well. Thank you all.